The title of my talk is Psychedelics in the Water. It's worth speaking to a particular lack that I've witnessed suck up a tremendous amount of the energy and leadership orientation in this space here in Australia as well as globally. There's plenty of people who people look to as leaders in the psychedelic context who couldn't be further from it. And the point I'm wanting to make here is rather than think about who would be good leaders, although that is a relevant question, we have to take a lot more seriously what goes into cultivating the fields that themselves can lead, the fields that can draw people into the best of their expression and to ennoble people and to encourage people. So what kind of virtues can enable that? Rather than being the finished product, how can we support each other? One of the things that Carl Jung said about psychedelics, and admittedly he didn't have much experience of psychedelics at the time he wrote this letter. Of course, he had more experience than most when it came to opening up to the unconscious, working with unconscious content. He was skeptical about psychedelics. He had just heard about LSD, and the only reference point he had for it was mescaline. And so, in corresponding with a man named Victor White, he was quite cautionary. And he said, among other things, to be wary of unearned wisdom, to be wary of touching a sphere where the paint is made. I do think that there is an important word of caution and indeed wisdom in Jung's advice. But today, and in particular with an understanding of indigenous traditions over many thousands and thousands of years, as well as, of course, research and experimentation among billions of people at this point, whether or not we should be wary or not, the cat is out of the bag, and we should probably be kind to it, I would say, probably be kind to our relation with psychedelics. But nevertheless, to be wary of unearned wisdom. And a point I would like to make, which I take to be analogous to it, is to be wary of unearned clarity. The kind of unearned clarity that comes along with something like LSD in the water. Because, of course, you can't see it. It can have all manner of effects. And just how is it working on you? The point here might be to think about ideology. Unearned clarity, not so far away from fixation and certainty, masquerading as clarity. Fixation, certainty, ideology, masquerading as clarity. So the question is, how do we relate with what comes through us, or the objects, the ideas, the concepts, the realizations, the revelations that we have in non-ordinary states, or just about any state at all? One of the ideas that is pegged in a way to the lack of wisdom associated with the psychedelic movement in the 60s, 70s, this sort of era, is the notion of something like, well, if only we could just put the LSD in the water supply, wouldn't that help connect people again, reconnect people to nature, reconnect people to themselves? It's insanity. It's insanity. But why? Why is it insanity? Is it wrong to open someone up? Is it wrong to ask a question? Is it wrong to invite someone into the depth of relating with a question? We're always influencing each other, right? Always influencing each other. We might think that we ought to be careful about the problems that we solve for each other, the problems that we steal from each other, the challenges that might be someone else's to overcome the suffering, even, that is for someone to relate with. But it seems to me that the very fact of our interdependence means we're always relating with each other's suffering and each other's joy. We're always influencing it. We can't step out of that alchemical process, not entirely. We might in some context aspire to. Indeed, this brings us close to the wisdom of caring about such things as transference and countertransference, and how we can be caught up in a whole bunch of different psychic dynamics with each other. But the contention I'm making is that we never totally get to remove ourselves from the picture, and that we should be honest about that, and we should take care with that. And so, what do we do with the conundrum of our influence? What do we do with the fact of how, just as a molecule like LSD or any number of other psychedelics reveal that with just a drop, just a sway this way rather than another way, we can open up to an entirely different sense of who we are and how we're connected. In a sense, there's such a tremendous amount of power that can be wielded. And what I'm trying to put out on the table here is that we have to contend with that dynamic from the outset. We have to recognize that we're always influencing and being influenced. I think the context of Beyond Psychedelics asks us to take seriously the whole suite of these influences, political through economic, the different kinds of power relations associated with institutions, and the kinds of questions that can be asked, and where the funding's coming from, social dynamics, survival drives, sexual drives. All of these are profoundly relevant in what is behind the curtain, influencing what is allowed to come onto the stage. Now, psychedelics can be one of those things which opens up something to make its presence known on the stage without invitation. And so it's for that kind of reason that someone like Stanislav Grof will refer to psychedelics as a non-specific amplifier. But I don't think that is ultimately the right way to think about them, because what might seem non-specific in terms of what comes through, I think just points to what is in the shadow that we are not aware of. And so the question is, how can we support each other to come into awareness about what is present? And that whether a psychedelic is part of that picture or not, it's always possible for us to open up questions and relate with these meanings. Why do I say it would be insane to put LSD in the water supply? Well, there's many reasons. I think a key one, they all really revolve around the abdication of responsibility that would be to be in relationship with the dynamics one was bringing or perpetuating into the system. You know, in this context and in culture writ large, I think if we're really to make the most of and do justice to what psychedelics can reveal about the nature of ourselves and each other and reality, we have to take seriously from the very beginning what's influencing our communicational fields and make the endeavor toward mastery as a property of a field rather than a capacity of individuals only. The aim, that caring about what gives and adds value to and uplifts fields of communication is what's necessary in order to actually not only relate with psychedelics, but to go beyond them into all the different ways that our very attitude towards psychedelics or mind manifesting occurs and is conditioned. That's really the core of what I would like to suggest to anyone listening to this. More than suggest, point very directly. I don't think the frames of therapy or individual wellness, individual healing in and of themselves are sufficient to lead and steward what it really is to relate with psychedelics, and indeed what it is to really relate with healing. We definitely have to focus on singularities where we can and meet each other in relationship. I'm not saying we shouldn't care or focus on the healing of individuals, but across the board, we need to take much more seriously what it's possible to presence in a context. And we don't need psychedelics to do that. Philosophy properly considered is psychedelic. Vital philosophy is psychedelic. Thank you all for listening. And the reason I mentioned the LSD in the water supply, obviously, is not to advocate for it. Partly because this attitude was, I think, one of the things that was bound up with some of the errors 50, 60 years ago. But also because, and I'm not going to name any names, it has been advocated for, maybe offhand as something like a joke, but a joke with a bit of something there, by one of the leading contexts, institutional in quotation marks, that's actually influential in moving legislature and championing certificates for therapy and what have you. So as ridiculous as the notion is, and to be fair, I did try to give the other side of it, right? I did try to speak to the way that we're so incredibly bound and entangled with each other that actually we've got to be way more real about the influence we have on each other and the risks that I think are necessary to embody. Can't illuminate anything unless there is a body, a form to actually be in the presence of, be in relation with that light. Now, sometimes, enlightenment is thought about, enabling the light to pass through and what have you. But even to bring these dynamics into play, notions of shadow, enlightenment, all these sorts of things, the tremendous power and influence and entanglement of that, the bar could not be any higher in order to relate with the complexities of what is at stake here. And so, yeah, I did want to bring that into presence. That is not something I'm advocating for. By the same token, we basically already live in a world in which LSD is in the air. Yeah, not literally, but in the sense of what's permeating all around at the level of meme, right? At the level of symbol, in the way we relate digitally. Like, things are already far more psychedelic than anyone can take. And so how we relate to how we shut down, dissociate, how we even make light of all these things is really interesting. So I didn't really communicate a lot of what I wanted to get at. I managed to, but just to be clear that there is, from my perspective, and this is a provocation I'll make and we can maybe return to, it's worth speaking to, a particular lack that I've witnessed suck up a tremendous amount of the energy and leadership orientation in this space here in Australia, as well as globally. There's plenty of people who people look to as leaders in a psychedelic context who couldn't be further from it. And the point I'm wanting to make here is, rather than think about who would be good leaders, although that is a relevant question, we have to take a lot more seriously what goes into cultivating the fields that themselves can lead, the fields that can draw people into the best of their expression and to ennoble people and to encourage people. So what kind of virtues can enable that? Rather than being the finished product, how can we support each other?